Are most people there now?
Yes, I think we could start.
Yeah?
Yeah.
Okay, Luis, do you want to introduce Letícia?
Yes, okay. So, hi everybody. Martin is home because he's sick, but he's participating in his pajamas in his bed.
I'm actually not wearing pajamas.
Oh, okay. And we have the pleasure to have Letícia Marteleto with us today. She's, as you can see, a professor at University of Texas at Austin. And that's the title of her talk there. And so I'll let you introduce yourself with more details, Letícia.
Letícia,
Yes.
let me just say something.
Yes, please, go ahead, Martin.
Okay, let me say a couple of words about Letícia. Letícia has participated in the Lemon Dialogue for several years now and has presented, the last time in Illinois, about her work on the Zika virus. And I don't know if Michelle Reddy is there.
Hi, Martin.
You're there?
Yeah.
Okay, well, I want you to connect with Letícia because this is the person you should talk to about your proposed work to look at the role of NGOs in Brazil around the Zika crisis. So Letícia is really an expert on this. Anyway, she teaches at Austin. She's a professor at Austin. And I'm going to try to get Letícia to come for 3 or 6 months to Stanford when she has a chance in the future. So we're really eagerly looking forward to your talk, Letícia. Thank you very much for doing this.
Great. Well, thank you for the kind words. Thank you for the introduction. Also, Martin, thank you for the invitation. I very much would like to strengthen the ties between us, because I think a lot of the research, as I will show that I do, have a lot of common ground with the wonderful research that's being done by you, your colleagues, and graduate students. So the way I thought about this presentation, I will talk a little bit about my recent research, just with the goal of becoming a resource for your students and colleagues, just so you know the work that I'm doing. And then I'm gonna go to this specific paper, which is on the effects of adolescent childbearing and union formation on women's education in Brazil. As you said, I'm at UT. I'm at the Population Research Center in Sociology. And this work specifically is done in co-authorship with a great graduate student, Aida Villanueva. So I would like to acknowledge Aida's work here as well. So just to give you a flavor, I've looked into the role of race, socioeconomic status, demographic factors like family size, early childbearing, and family factors on educational outcomes. I've looked at years of schooling, graduation, grade repetition in Brazil, and this was like a bigger deal than it is now, and test scores as well. So my work on race, for example, I've looked at race inequality, the role of race inequality in education. I have those 2 pieces published in Demography. The first one there, I used twin fixed effects to try to handle the issue of unobservables, because when we compare the associations of race and educational outcomes, we are looking, we don't have all the variables, the family variables to account for. With twin fixed effects, what I did was I found twins in the Brazilian PNADs that were labeled with different races. And this way we took care of unobservables. So that's one piece where we try really to look at causal effects there. With socioeconomic status, with work published, looking at the role of cultural capital and education inequalities over time, comparing Brazil with other countries, but more recently looking at the reforms in higher education access, really looking at college access and what has changed in the previous decades with the policies of affirmative action. Then family and gender factors. This is more work on South Africa. I've done some work on South Africa as well. I participated in the CAPS, the Cape Area Penal Study, data collection in Cape Town. And then finally, family size, which is really an intersection of my work as a sociologist and as a demographer, which is looking at how family size really matters for education for the kids' years of schooling and mixed with gender. So sort of like, if you have more siblings or fewer siblings, is that going to have an impact? And in this case, we use twins as instrumental variables to also try to gauge at causal effects of family size. With the idea that, in this case, with the idea that twins are an increase in fertility in family size that was not expected. So it's an unexpected increase in fertility. So the idea of the endogeneity between family size, or how many children one would have, couples would have in education, sort of like the quantity and quality paradox, we would be trying to remove that. So I have a series of papers on that. And what I'm going to talk about today is on the role of really adolescent childbearing. On what point in the life course women have children, and how does that matter for their educational advancement? So in the first paper that was published in Demographic Research, we looked first at the effect of maternal age at childbearing on adolescent education, but for the kids of the adolescent mother. So this is really intergenerational. The one I'm presenting now today looks at the women's education themselves, how a birth, an early birth, will have an impact on their education. So the rationale for this is that, so most studies who have looked at this question have found that really a first birth and a first marital union, when these events happen early on, they have a negative effect or a negative association in a range of social and economic outcomes, including education, human capital. The issue with that is that it might be that that this relationship is not really causal, may not reflect a causal effect, because it might be that it's something else, poverty, for example, that really put those women in that one condition, in that maybe they would have the same educational outcomes even if they didn't have that birth to begin with, right? They were under poverty circumstances, for example. I'll talk about that in a minute. The magnitude of this disadvantage. So when studies have not used anything to take care of that potential issue, even the magnitude of the disadvantage identified has been inconsistent, depending on the method used and on the context, meaning low and income countries or high income countries, for example. For Brazil specifically, there's a dearth of data. There's no data that would really identify the timing of events, and that has hindered the examination of this question in an appropriate way. So we don't know. So if we get the PNAD, for example, or the census of even PISA, we have the ages. PISA, we don't even have the whole household, but in household data sets, we know the ages of the kids who are in the household. We know the years of schooling, but we don't know when that kid, what happened before or after. We don't know the order of events. We don't know the timing of events. Why would it be that adolescent childbearing or the timing of childbearing would matter for women's education? Well, looking at purely a resource allocation perspective, it's women, when they are adolescents, have clearly not finished their educational path. They have less chance of have established a career. They have fewer resources available to them. There's also a stream of research that will point to the lack of psychological and emotional tools to offer to those their children. Yet a causal link is really difficult to be established. as I was saying, the evidence show a clear negative association. However, the adolescent mothers would not necessarily have fared better had they waited to have a birth later on or had they remained childless. Also, the role on unobserved factors might have an influence in both teen childbearing and socioeconomic outcomes. So it might be that there is a bunch of other variables that influence both teen childbearing and education, for example, 8 years of schooling or graduation from high school. So the negative outcomes could be mostly due to preceding socioeconomic disadvantages. There's a second, what I call a second generation of empirical studies that have attempted to empirically try to handle this problem, and the results have been mixed. Yet this research has been mostly conducted using data from high-income countries. There's limited data in developing countries, specifically data that has information on a bunch of characteristics of the women while growing up. So before any chance of childbearing. So for example, social class while growing up. Were these women in poverty early on in their lives? Now, the second question that we try to attempt, to look at is the role of adolescent unions as well. And here we take a perspective of a cumulative disadvantage. So there are two kinds of hypotheses in the literature. One is that marital unions would strengthen traditional gender roles. So women would increase the amount of time they spend in household labor, right, if they are married, leaving them with less time to really advance in their educational path and career later on. So family demands cause them to turn down beneficial work opportunities as well. Also, there's a stream of research that will say that they lose, if they marry, they lose the support from the extended kin, especially mothers. There's actually some evidence that point to that, especially their own mothers, the grandparents of the babies. Yet research is inconclusive, especially for developing countries. The literature is mostly descriptive, and it might be even that the benefits of family of origin could be overestimated. So there are researchers who will say, well, in some countries, the extended family will help. Well, there's some research that has shown that this benefit has been overestimated, could have been overestimated. They may not be capable of providing so much support as they have done in the past, especially with the high proportion of women in the labor force. So these grandmothers might as well be working these days, right, in these new cohorts, which wasn't the case 20 years ago. So there's evidence of the association between SES and the quality of parental help in there. So what are our research questions specifically, just to make sure we are on the same page? What is the impact of adolescent childbearing on women's educational outcomes? And does this effect fade when we account for selectivity? Second, does a marital union interact with adolescent childbearing to create additional educational disadvantage? So in other words, the women who are adolescent mothers and who are also in a marital union, does that union imply in advantages or disadvantages to them, right? And we are gonna look at years of education and high school graduation. Those are the true outcomes that we have. Unfortunately, in this data set, it almost looks like that either we have the household information and we don't have test scores. For example, it would be lovely if we could also look into test scores, but we don't. So we have years of education cumulated and whether women graduated from high school or not. So we believe we are extending this research to determine the impact of adolescent childbearing in union on measures reflecting girls' educational quality. We are looking into doing that because we are collecting data on Zika, on the Zika project. I can talk more about that later, but we are including lots of measures on years of education of the kids, high school graduation, social class while growing up, and some measures of educational quality. So we can also like talk about educational quality and just not those more rough measures of education. So to give you, do you have, okay, to give you a flavor here. So this is the proportion of adolescent mothers selected in Latin American countries. So just to ground this research, why is it important? Almost a quarter of Brazilian women ages 20 to 49 were mothers during adolescence. This is a high proportion, even for Latin American standards. Latin America as a whole has low age at childbearing, at first childbearing, and the proportion of teenage childbearing is high, and Brazil is even higher. So almost a quarter of them have given birth during adolescence. Also interesting, and I mean, you forgive me for a second, after all, I'm also a demographer and not just a sociologist. So the fertility pattern in Brazil is quite low. So fertility rate, the overall fertility rate is very low. It's 1.8 in Brazil, which is a little lower than that in the United States. Yet that fertility is really young. I mean, it's still young for a country with below replacement fertility levels. And this is showing that that the fertility of adolescents 15 to 29, 20 to 24, I mean, is really high still. So even though fertility has been declining, there is still a high proportion of fertility that happens early on. So to examine those questions, we use
Excuse
data.
me, Letícia.
Yes.
Can you go back? So the fertility rate in Brazil is lower, is overall quite low now?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it is. It's 1.8. It's lower than in the US.
Yeah.
And it's below replacement. Replacement level is 2. In Brazil,
Right.
It's 1.8.
So this is 1.8 children for women under 40, is that it?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's quite low. So one would expect that in a low fertility regime, there wouldn't be fertility among teenagers. The pattern has been a pattern of shifting the age. Yet what this shows is that still, I mean, it's lower, right? I have there 1991, 2000, and 2010. It is definitely lower, but almost, I mean, a huge part is still like young there. Usually we see almost like a U-shaped inversion.
This is the same fertility rate that shows like 0.8 in Spain and Northern
Yes.
Italy? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay.
Spain is like the extreme. Spain and Italy. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you for the question. So we use data from the School to Work Transition Survey. I mean, so the point there, Martin, is that we are talking about a large proportion of the population. Like a lot of these women have had children early, despite the low fertility rate. So anyway, so the data. So we use data from the School to Work Transition Survey collected by the ILO in 2013. 3,288 respondents, but in our analytical sample, we examined women only. And the reason why we we started out looking at men and women, but apparently men don't have kids at this age, or they don't report that they have kids. So there has been in the literature a lot of recognition that it's fertility among, I mean, asking about first childbearing for male adolescents is, anyways, yeah, they are not informing the births, and they don't know, and so on and so forth. So we examine women. So some of the strengths of the data are that we have information on the social and economic background of young adults during childhood. So we know pre the birth, the adolescent birth, many characteristics, or some, I should say. We also have information on the age at first union and age at first birth, information that's rarely available for low and middle income countries, rarely available for Brazil. We also the data covers all young people and not only children of the head of the household. So most of my research, I've used household survey data, we can only look at the kids who are inside the household with their parents. And that's not the case here. They interviewed people aged 15 to 29 and asked about parents' education, parents' occupation, all those markers of social class while growing up for all of them. We use our analytical sample is ages 19 to 29 because we had obviously to wait until the event really happened. So at age 19, if you're not, or 20, 19 and 20, if you didn't have give birth at 15, 16, 17, 18, that's not gonna happen anymore. So we restricted the sample to women aged 19 and older. Our dependent variables are years of education and graduation from high school. We are interested in adolescent birth and early marital union. And we control for the usual suspects: age, race, parental education, parental occupation, urban, rural, region of residence, migration status, social class during childhood. And our confounding variables that we are able to account for. And this is both a blessing and a curse. A blessing because we have those variables. We have socioeconomic class during childhood. We have parental education, parental occupation, migration, race, but we could have more, right? One variable, for example, that we would love to have would be family structure while growing up, and we don't have that, right? So we have we have some, it's better than most, but we don't have, and our models, all are fine, but it would have been better. This is definitely a limitation if we had more. So for this data collection, we are including a set of variables, collecting more information on kids when they were growing up. Young adults for when they were growing up. So we have those outcomes, the methods. We do OLS for the years of schooling and obviously logistic regression for high school completion. And we do all those regression adjustments to weight the data and run our propensities to see if the results still hold when we reweight the data. So these are the methods that we use, and we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Here's the proportion of women by age at first birth. So I told you that in the general data, about 25% of the women in Brazil ages 20 to 49 have given birth when they were adolescents. This is our data. So this is the age at first child. So 5.2% of them gave birth when they were 14 and younger, 9.83% when they were 15. In other words, we have 51% became mothers during adolescence in our data. Again, this data is young adults, right? So it's a data on women 15 to 29. So these are young adults, and it's really high. So you have there the proportion. So 13.9, 14% when they were 17, and 13.59 when they were 18.
You don't have this by race, do you?
We do. That's a good question to show. That would be interesting, right? To show. We do, definitely. Yeah, and I bet the pattern would be the pattern of non-whites having even higher rates. But that's a very good point that we could address. So among the teen mothers, 60% of them were in a first union while adolescents. And that is different for the case of Brazil and other places. In some countries like the United States, an adolescent childbearing is not necessarily leading to a union or vice versa. So a high proportion are in a marital union by the time of that first birth. So, but because we only have the age at childbearing and age at first union, a limitation of our work, another limitation is that we don't know what came first, right? We only have the age. So in terms of marital union and childbearing, we know for many cases, but what if they married and gave birth in the same age? Because 9 months, they could have gotten pregnant, right? So we don't have the dates, we have the age, right? So this is tricky for us to include marital union in the model. the way we did it is we considered before the childbearing at least a year prior, right? But we are being cautious, maybe too cautious here. In terms of mean years of schooling by age at first birth, we can see that the women who gave birth at during adolescence have lower years of school, mean years of schooling. So if they gave birth at age 14 and younger, for example, they have 6.48 years of schooling. Whereas if they gave birth at age 18, they have 2 more years of schooling already. And if they waited 19 or older or became childless, that number is 10.33. So just by looking at these numbers, I mean, just the descriptives, we see that there is a difference and that there is a disadvantage. So the women who gave birth during adolescence have significantly lower years of schooling completed than the ones who did not. The same thing, what happened here? The same thing with the proportion completing high school. So by the time we see them ages 19 and older, only a third of the ones who gave birth at adolescence have completed high school, whereas 70% of them who remain childless or waited until the age of 19 at least, have 69% have completed. I will pause here for a second because, again, the sample that we look is a young sample. So these are women 19 to 29. So it might be that these women could catch up later, right? They could catch up. If we looked at them at the age of 40, they could catch up. However, studies show that once they lose track and they are 19 already, their chances of really completing high school, and we know that high school is a bottleneck today in Brazil, right, becomes lower and lower. So here are some results for you. So I'm only showing the coefficient on adolescent childbearing, but just so you know, we are controlling for the other variables that I mentioned before. So here in the new model, we see that the simple difference between women who were mothers during adolescence and those who were not, the difference is 2.28 years of schooling, fewer schooling among the women who were adolescent mothers. This is, the no model is including no controls. When we control for a bunch of things that we control for race, socioeconomic status while growing up, parental education, region of residence, of course, this disadvantage will decline, right? When we start using the matching procedures, we adjust, we use the matching SEM and then the one-to-one, the inverse probability weights. Those are all techniques that are similar yet a little bit different. We see that the disadvantage is further smaller, but it's still there. It remains, and it is significant. So there's still, even when we control and we weight the data, we still have a disadvantage in years of schooling completed for the women who were mothers during adolescence. If we keep going and look at high school completion, the difference in the new model was 0.419, not controlling for anything. When we control, declines a little bit. And of course, it keeps declining, but it remains. So there is still a disadvantage in high school completion for women who were mothers during adolescence. Here is just comparing the models, just summarizing, right? The regression on regular samples versus the matched samples. That's what we have there. The disadvantage remains, persists. And here it's the same thing again, but in graph format. If we predict the years of schooling, and if we predict the probabilities of completing high school, these women are at a disadvantage of 1.5 years of schooling and 50%, I want to say, or 40% disadvantage, or it's lower probability of completing high school.
Letícia, what is the matching model you use, CEM?
It's the course inverted technique, I want to say. Let me look. I have to.
You don't use neighbor to neighbor, right?
It's the quotient exact matching. No, we don't use neighbor to neighbor. We use the course exact matching. That's the CEM. We use, let me go back. We use the inverse here. We use the inverse probability weighting regression adjustment, the augmented inverse probability weighting. We don't use the neighbor, no. So there we go. So here we have, so this was our first question, right? Are adolescent mothers disadvantaged? And the answer is yes. Now, among our adolescent mothers, are those adolescent mothers in unions disadvantaged, right? So here, what we do is very simple. We estimate this in two ways, slightly different but the same. And in the paper, reviewers asked us to drop this analysis that I'm going to show you, but I decided to show you just because we have it. So here we just look among adolescent mothers, does a marital union matter, right, for them or not? And what it tells us is that adolescent mothers who are in a marital union are even more disadvantaged. In other words, a union does not seem to help adolescent mothers further their educational careers. That's what this looks like. Now, because, and I told you a few minutes ago, we don't have information on month of events. It might be that we are confusing here the order of events, right? With the marital union and the birth, right? It might, we don't have the order. This is not a pure result, I should say, right? Because we don't have such information. The other way we...
Letícia, is this supposed to be a minus in front of the 0.394 or plus?
It's plus, but it's loaded. So in that
case, I see. It's
0.394. Yeah. So it is still a disadvantage there. Yeah. And this, I have to say that it surprised me. Aida, my graduate student and co-author, her bet was that an adolescent union would be disadvantageous to women because of the traditional gender roles in the household and etc. And for me, I felt, no, it's gonna help because she has the partner and apparently it hurts. That's what the results are telling us. So another way, so these are the predicted probabilities. So using the same model, we just, look at the differences. So it's about 1 year of schooling and 20% point in union in the probability of graduating from high school. The other way that we did this is through an interaction, right? Is there an interaction between adolescent childbearing and adolescent union in determining educational disadvantages, which is likely the same thing. But so even if we interact, we see disadvantages in years of schooling. We don't see in the graduating from high school, they disappear there, but they remain if being in both conditions, that it hurts the most. Women, and here compared to not having remaining childless and or having waited until age 19. So these are the predicted years of schooling if we with the interaction. So not an early mother and not in an early union, so the highest 10.6 predicted years of education. Not in early mother but in an early union, 9. An early mother and not in an early union, 9 as well. And the worst, in early mother and in an early union. So it looks like both events at the same time are not helping Brazilian women. I mean, in fact, are like producing 2 years of a disadvantage in their education. We ran a bunch of sensitivity analysis because we still have issues with unobservables, right? I mean, we don't have, as I said, household structure while growing up. We have a limited set of pre-event to use. Yet when we conducted deterministic and probabilistic sensitivity analysis, they're all here. We can talk more about them. But in the results, the way we did this, by the way, we found the PNADI 2014 has a variable on family structure at age 15. So we use that, and still the results hold. If there's about a 5% of potential bias and about a 7% of potential bias in the probabilistic. So the suggested and measured confounding is not a major factor affecting our results. Of course, I mean, there's always unobservables that can plague our results. So just to conclude, the negative associations between adolescent childbearing and educational outcomes remain, even after accounting for differential selection. Adolescent childbearing is associated with 1.6 to around 2.28 fewer years of schooling for those women who were adolescent mothers, and a decrease of about 35% in the predicted probabilities of completing high school. And these are our most conservative estimates. So the effects remain large and significant, even after accounting for differential selection in early motherhood. So we see this as an additional layer of disadvantage for teenage mothers, childbearing, but also those who form an early marital union. I mean, those who form an early marital union have fewer years of schooling than those who are not. And the reason here is that, and if we get the PNADI data and we look at the household structure of adolescent mothers, of those women who have young children in the household, many do live with the extended families, right? With the parents, with their parents. So this still happens. The parents might not be able to help much, but the fact that they are living with them might still help. Now, in a country when the social safety net is eroding and eroding, we can imagine that this not having the family, the extended family, will be problematic later on, especially for women. Among women who are teen mothers, adolescent unions are also consequential, as I said. 1 fewer year of schooling and 52% lower predicted probabilities of graduating from high school. As I said throughout the presentation, as with every work, there are limitations. We assume on the selection on observables. We observe women 19 and older, so the catching up factor might play a role here, although I don't think that it would eliminate the disadvantage at all. It could diminish, but not eliminate completely. I think it's a large enough disadvantage that I don't think the catching up would make too much of a difference. We have a relatively small sample size, which is a blessing and a curse. A blessing because our results are we still achieve statistical significance, even with small sample sizes. We wish we had more covariates pre-birth, information while women were growing up, and we are working on that. We are including more variables also reflecting quality of education, private or public, area of study. Once the data, I mean, the data was collected in July 2017 with the seed grant, and we are working on it to collect in our second city of study, which will be Belo Horizonte. The other one was Recife, where we interviewed women. So that's what I have prepared, and I want to thank you very much for listening, and I'm available, to continue this conversation.
Luis, I'm going to ask, I can't see everybody, so this was just a terrific talk. Thank you very much, Letícia.
My
really
pleasure. Anytime.
I will, if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you the first question, and then I'm going to ask Luis to recognize other people. Sure. So this issue of the marital union plus the early childbirth is very interesting. So it seems that you have data on from the PNADI of the household structure. So is it the case that the adolescent women who are in a marital union are less likely to be living with the extended family? Are you able to distinguish that? Because if that were the case, that might explain, because then the husband would be working, the young woman would have to stay at home, and it would be very difficult for her to keep going to school.
You know, that seems to be the case. We have, thank you for your question, and that seems to be the case. They are less likely to be with the extended family, though it still happens that those couples are with the extended family. This is more common in some areas than in other areas of the country. So for example, in the other paper that we wrote about this, we found that in the North and Northeast, it's more common than in the South and Southeast, that it's this kind of arrangement is getting less and less common. If I had to bet money, I would, my explanation would be precisely the explanation you gave, that the partner is probably out of the household and working, and they are living by themselves, and the traditional gender, division of household labor really is hurting women in that case. We debated as to, in this data set, we don't have the household structure. In the PNAD data set, we do. But it's also very endogenous. So we would have to look into that as well, right? I mean, is it that they went to live with the extended family because of the birth or not because of the birth? But it's something that we can definitely look, and we have looked. And it is true that it is, I mean, if I had to bet, it is because of traditional gender, division of household labor.
Great. Well, Luis, take over here, so, because I can't see the people.
Of course, no problem. So, questions? Letícia?
I have a question. I wonder if there is any data available about the fathers and how that could try to explain the results. Perhaps the father is also a teenager or not, something like that.
So thank you for your question. We don't have information on the fathers of those babies in the data, right? We have information on women and on men, on their like births and all that on this data set. What we could see is that at the same young age, because they are the same age, the men that we interviewed, there are fewer males who are fathers during adolescence, or at least fewer males who reported being a father during adolescence. This is not uncommon and not so. This is not surprising because of the age, the homogamy in the age, or heterogamy, I would say, in the age of partnerships. So we could, there's no data that could take care of that, having the characteristics that we have to look into the causal effects and everything. Again, we can go back to the PNAD and we can try to figure out just descriptively what it is that those fathers are doing, right? So we know their labor force participation, how many hours they are working. We have all this information, and I could provide a sense of like, who are those young fathers, right? So that can be done, but not for this one analysis.
Okay, by the way, congrats for the talk, Letícia.
Thank you so much.
Could I ask another question? Why don't you, it would be great if you would just interact race with your treatment variable there.
That's a great idea.
And just see if it's a simple thing to do, and you could see if it's positive for pardos and pretos. I would, because it could be that it could be that a large part of your effect is mixing class and race,
Yeah. So we include race in the pre-treatment, right? And we include race.
You control for it.
Yeah, we control for it, but we don't interact for it. So
Right.
I think it would be interesting to look into that, and especially because it it merges my streams of research, right? Race and this. I think one reason why we didn't do much, and we can still go back and do it, is because our sample starts to get smaller and smaller. So once we start, you know, but yes, I will go ahead and do that, and I'll write you a note and telling you what.
Yeah, well, you're just adding a few variables. I mean, it's
Yeah,
not going to.
it's not going to be a big deal. Yeah. And I like this idea because the way we frame the paper is we frame it around, is this one more layer of disadvantage, right? Childbearing, or in this case, gender, is this one more layer of disadvantage, and
Right.
race is another important layer of disadvantage in Brazil. So
Well, you could see whether it's a problem for the union thing too. I mean, you could interact that with race also. So
yes,
you could interact both variables with race.
Yep. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that would fit in very well with your previous research.
Yeah, it's a way of merging, almost like merging those streams of research. Yeah,
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you for the suggestion.
Leticia, I have a question. I was wondering about, you mentioned that you control for rural versus urban, and also about regional differences in Brazil. And I know your study is, this particular one is about the city of Recife, right? Can you give us more information about this difference between rural? Do you have information about difference between rural and urban? And also, do you anticipate a difference? You mentioned that the next city you're going to study is Belo Horizonte. So do you have any sense if that makes a difference in the kind of data you're getting?
Sure, thank you. That's a great question. So we control for rural and urban, and we control for region as well. So this data set is really nationally representative, right? So we can do that. And the data set that we use for the other paper around the same topic, but the paper that we looked at, the educational disadvantages of the kids of the adolescent mothers, we use the DHS, which is also nationally representative, and it's much larger samples. What we found in terms of household structure is that in the north and northeast areas of the country, the women who had a child age 1 or younger and were adolescent mothers, I want to say like 26% of them, if I remember correctly, don't quote me on the 26 or 29, a third or a fourth, were living with their extended family. Now, in the Southeast region, it was something like 8%, a much smaller proportion of adolescent mothers were living with the extended family. And some were with the partner and some were living without the partner. But it was more likely that they were living with the extended family if they were not with the partner. So it's very interesting. The patterns seem to be in that sense. Now, with the data that we are collecting, that we collected and are preparing to go to the field again, is data, I mean, the motivation of this study was really reproductive health of women, if there were changes in reproductive health throughout the Zika epidemic. So we did first focus groups in Recife and Belo Horizonte. Why Recife and Belo Horizonte? Because Recife was in Pernambuco, the first place where the Zika epidemic really, I mean, where the virus was found and where like the highest rates of microcephaly were found in those, like 18% of all cases of microcephaly were in Recife. So we wanted to compare and contrast a place with high incidence with one with low incidence. Now, so that is like the Zika project, but I included information on the education, years of schooling, public, private, enrollment, etc., of every kid in the household. So we have information on the women and we have information on the children of these women. So we will be able to do the same kind of analysis with this data set. So we did focus groups first, and then we did surveys in Recife already, and we are going to the field in Belo Horizonte again. And I mean, I can tell you about like many differences in how women were perceiving the epidemic, but really my interest is really how much more stratification, you know, we are getting because of this epidemic. That's sort of like the overarching question. And we have information on the education of the kids.
Thank you.
Sure, thank you.
Still have some more time for questions.
Questions, comments? I mean, if also I wanted to say, like, I wanted to tell like the graduate students in the audience, if you see any commonality with my research and what you're thinking for your proposals or your master's thesis or dissertation, feel free to contact me. I would be happy, you know, to send you my papers or discuss any ideas. I mean, I'd like to be a resource for the graduate students. So please feel free to contact me with questions or ideas and etc. I'll be happy to.
You know, the thing that strikes me about this is that there seems to it seems there's discussion about the Northeast versus the Southeast, and the difference between more traditional areas and more so-called modern areas. But that it seems that there's a kind of dysfunctionality of modern society to deal with. There's a conflict between the idea of modern society of people becoming educated, not educated, but in staying in school until they finish adolescence, and the sort of more traditional idea of young women, very young women, having children, which after all in traditional societies was not unusual at all. You know, once women reached puberty, they generally had families. They started to have families. So obviously in Brazil, this is still going on at a pretty high rate. And there's this kind of dysfunctionality with modern society not being able to deal with this very traditional behavior. And the traditional society seems to be more able to handle it in terms of absorbing the woman and her child into the extended family and allowing her to continue her education sort of as a symbol of modernity.
I really like this observation, and because it puts the whole thing into sort of like a developmental perspective almost, if you will. And I think it's like really social cohesion, right? I mean, it's really sort of like this kind of like what we are calling so-called traditional. They have the extended family living close by, and you know, the grandparents, the mothers can still like fulfill those like traditional roles of helping taking care of the kids, right? But once we start pushing with like mass, you know, schooling, and the grandparents, the grandmothers are really in the labor force and all of those things, then I don't think any other system was put in place to still account for, you know, what if something like this happens, right? We don't have a system in place that would buffer those. I think that's a really nice take-home message. It's sort of like a discordance between what's being expected, right? I mean, go work, get educated, this and that, but there's no really social safety net, right? I mean, at all. Families fulfill this role, but they might not be able to because they are being asked to do other things. So that's something for us to really
the modern solution is contraception, and and in a Catholic society, you're not supposed to go into the schools and tell young women and men that you know, to use contraceptives and to make them free or to make them very cheap. So this is a taboo. And but that certainly has worked in the United States to do that. To, you know, but
I mean, and there's whole discussion on abortion. Don't even get me started, right? Especially in the case of Zika, in times of Zika. I mean,
right.
that's not even. I mean, so yeah. So the role
we have the same problem at the other end of the spectrum, because in a traditional society, older people were absorbed into the family, stayed with the family. Of course, now people are living longer. The families don't particularly want to care for these people, or they can't care for the older people because it's they're both working, and it's a very, very interesting phenomenon how traditional society was able to handle stuff that modern society can't do anymore. So
it's a very similar issue. It's at the other end of the, you know, the life course, but it's it's germane. I mean, where is the social safety net there? It has been families, but families are not being able to fulfill that role.
Families and communities.
And communities, exactly.
Yeah. And communities break down also, so
it's, and I mean, and I think the spin I see on this is really a gender spin as well, in that, I mean, we know, I mean, well, all the disadvantages associated with gender, and this is one disadvantage.
Well, and then women are supposed to take care of all this in the social structure. You know, it's women's role. I mean, women has been assigned the role to sort of take, you know, absorb all this dysfunctionality of the modern society. Anyway, are there any other questions here?
I'd like to ask a question. Letícia, you show different countries in Latin America. What are these countries doing different than what's happening in Brazil?
You know, I showed the figure. Let me pull it. Maybe I should have even other countries. The point of this figure here is to show that even in other Latin American countries, the proportion of adolescent mothers is high, right? In Brazil, it is highest. I mean, it's the highest, right? If we compare with other Latin American countries. So, if we compare with like the rest of the world, this is high. So we can discuss like, so what are other countries doing differently? You mean other Latin American countries or other countries in general, in terms of like offering contraception, those kinds of things to prevent adolescent childbearing? Or,
for example, comparing with Paraguay. What's Paraguay doing for, you know, being that the lowest in your graphic?
Yeah, I would say more contraception. I would say contraception is the key here, but not just excess. And I think there's a lot of research that has shown that only excess will not take care of this. It's really showing, especially women from low socioeconomic status backgrounds, how to use them correctly. In the interviews, the focus groups that we conducted, you would be amazed by how women discuss how the lack of knowledge on using contraception. There's also gender roles in the use of contraception. So men, for example, especially in low SES settings, do not refuse to use condoms, for example. This is very widespread in the literature. So there's a lot to be done, not in terms of only access, but also in terms of promoting the use of contraception and the correct use of contraception. And I don't know specifically what Paraguay has done to, you know, like change this, but my take would be one of those two venues, either like offering more access and correct use.
Any other social safety nets that do you recommend, for example?
I mean, policies, right? I mean, so for example, South Africa had a policy of really the government providing resources for adolescent mothers. I mean, if they became mothers, and they got into a huge criticism because the public would say, well, women will get pregnant because of these grants, right? Offering this grant. Well, very serious research has shown that that is not the case. Women are not going to get pregnant to get that money. That's not true, but that is a way that you could maintain the independence of those young mothers, right? In terms of how to raise their children and maintain a decent standard of living. So that is something that could be discussed. I mean, not in our political scenario right now, not at all. I mean, I know, but that's something that has been shown to like increase the well-being of the children of those adolescent mothers and of the adolescent mothers as well.
It's really too bad that you don't have data on the men, because I would bet that the effect on the men, in general, women have more schooling than men. And so the effect on the men may be even greater. This would be pretty interesting.
Well, but so we tried with this data. We don't know the fathers of this, I mean, of those, I mean, the partners of these women, but we do have data on men, right?
Right.
And they do not report. I mean, men at this age do not report. I mean, there's even almost no variation. They don't report becoming fathers.
Right. That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, exactly. So that's exactly the point.
Yeah.
Yes. But this is a result in itself. This is a finding in itself, right? I mean,
Sophia has a question for you, Letícia.
It's more of a comment, I think. We usually talk more after presentations. I was thinking that perhaps it's because it's so astonishing, the data that you present. It's so important. It's important for education in Brazil. We've been talking a lot about adolescents that drop out of school when they also are not working, the so-called names. But then,
the names, exactly.
Yeah, and then you are presenting information on what's behind them. And
yeah.
I'm thinking about school principals. I'm thinking about any small secretary of education. We all should know more about that, you know, because for me, it was the first time I saw something like that. And I'm absolutely in shock, you know, because it's, what are we doing?
No.
What are we doing in terms of the education system to prevent this? I'm not talking only about childbirth prevention. I'm talking about measurements of helping, of educating, and doing things that could, you know, stop them from getting out of school. What are the programs do we have? Nothing. We have nothing.
So I'm very grateful for your comment, because it makes me think, I mean, some discussions I've had on this, sort of like on the stigma also associated with being an adolescent mother, right? Which still happens like pretty heavily in schools, right? So some of the qualitative research that we've done in the South African context, not in Brazil in this case, but has shown the stigma associated. And also those girls not having the conditions to things like maybe even bring the baby, or maybe like being able to make up for that work, or having extended simple things, quote unquote, that could be established maybe inside school to give them the conditions to persist, to try to persist, and not necessarily completely drop out of school, right? So, but you're right, it makes us wonder and think like what can be done at the sort of like the I mean, school principal level, schools, right? I mean, to help them persist, right? And if you think that girls in Latin America are ahead of boys in years of schooling and in high school graduation, and these girls who are adolescent mothers are way behind, and if we think of the mean and average, it is very interesting to see that their disadvantage is really high, right? I mean, if overall girls are ahead, but these are so behind, you know, sort of like they are really at the bottom of the disadvantage.
Congratulations, great work.
Thank you so much.
Letícia, we have another question.
Hi, Letícia. Just a quick point. In terms of policy recommendations, you might want to look at Ireland. where abortion is illegal, but there's a lot of strong social policies, particularly for younger mothers. Like, for instance, the universities offer things like distance learning. There's a lot of children's allowance because the government, you know, realizes more or less if you outlaw abortion, it's hypocritical to also not offer support for mothers. Yeah.
That's a nice suggestion. Thank you. Yeah. I mean, another like very Catholic country with, you know.
This might be something interesting to look at.
Yeah. Great. Thank you.
Anything else? Letícia, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin.
Terrific talk. We have not discussed this at all. That's why I was so excited when you said that you were going to present this, because this has not been part of our conversation so far, and it's truly important information. So let's give a big round of applause for Letícia.